welcome to today's edition of Full Scottish. My name's Ruth Watson. My guest today, and you're in for an excellent programme ahead, I have to say, Campbell Gemmell, who's advisor to the OECD, that's the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, and is the founding trustee of Environmental Rights Scotland. Hugh Marshall is the founder of Talking Wales and is very involved in political reporting in Wales. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. There's an interesting programme ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to be here.
Good. Well, before we come to the news, our guests' views on today's news, I shall go through today's update on the Russian war in Ukraine. The Ukraine update, day 753. Russia accused Ukraine of using terrorist activities to try to disrupt its presidential election, and former President Dmitry Medvedev described as traitors the scattered protesters who started fires at voting booths and poured dye into ballot boxes. Russian state news agency TASS claimed that a Ukrainian drone dropped an explosive close to a polling station in the occupied Zaporizhzhia region of Ukraine. Resistance forces set off an explosion near a polling station in Russian-occupied Skadovsk in the Kherson Oblast, injuring 5 Russian soldiers. Nexta reported 11 attempts to set fire to polling stations in Russia, along with 19 cases of ballot boxes being spoiled with paint. Russian authorities have proposed 8-year prison sentences for those involved. The Slavyansk oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar region caught fire on Sunday after a Ukrainian drone attack, and 1 person died from a suspected heart attack, local officials said. Videos online showed explosions and fire, along with the sound of drones approaching the site. On Sunday morning, the Russian Defense Ministry reported 35 Ukrainian drone incursions, including 4 in the Moscow region and 2 in the neighbouring Kaluga and Yaroslavl regions. More Ukrainian drones attacked in the Belgorod, Kursk and Rostov regions bordering Ukraine and in the southern Krasnodar region, the Defense Ministry said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky praised the Ukrainian military for its new long-range capability in a statement posted on Saturday night. What our own drones are capable of is a true Ukrainian long-range capability. Ukraine will now always have a strike force in the sky, he said on social media. Zelensky's comments followed Ukrainian drones striking 2 Rosneft oil refineries in Russia's Samara region. The Volga River's region's Syzran refinery was on fire, and officials also confirmed an attack on the Novokuzbesk refinery. Numerous other attacks during the past week have caused major damage to Russian oil refineries. Attacks continued on Russia's Belgorod Oblast, with the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming air defense shot down 15 rockets. 5 people were wounded when a Ukrainian drone hit a car in the village of Glotovo, 2 kilometers (1.25 miles) from the Ukrainian border. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told state media Vladimir Putin was being constantly briefed by his military leaders on the situation at the border. Putin is all but certain of victory in the election after dissent has been crushed. Russia's defense ministry said on Saturday that Ukrainian reconnaissance groups had attempted an incursion from Ukraine's Sumy region, following an armed incursion claimed by Ukraine-based Russian opponents of the Kremlin on Tuesday in the Belgorod and Kursk regions. The death toll in the Russian missile attack on civilian infrastructure in Odessa rose to 21 after an injured emergency worker died in hospital. More than 50 people were still in hospital, Odessa deputy mayor Svetlana Bedreha said on Saturday. There has been a record growth in the number of Russian men aged 31 to 59 with disabilities, the UK Defence Ministry said in its daily intelligence briefings. Well, moving on to Gaza, at least 31,645 Palestinians have been killed and 73,676 have been injured in Israeli strikes on Gaza since the 7th of October. Ceasefire talks resume in Qatar today. Israel has been accused of using hunger as a weapon of war, as the UNRWA reports unprecedented levels of malnutrition in Gaza. When do you think, guys, will Israel be told enough is enough? Campbell, it's utterly heartbreaking and devastating to be a bystander watching what is happening. What's your view of the moves that we're now seeing from the global community towards Israel? Do you think they're coming close to saying quite forcefully you have to stop?
I'd like to think so, although clearly we should have stopped a long time ago, or stopped them a long time ago. I agree with you. It's astonishing, it's depressing, it's tragic, I can't think of another word other than evil, actually, because the way in which, as the SNP's leader in Westminster has observed, that collective punishment is being administered to the Palestinian people is just extraordinary. If we were all to be held accountable for the worst among us, to the extent that we all suffered, that would be a pretty unimaginable thing, although elements of it seem to be now part of the worldwide model. I think both in the US and in the UK, we have leaders who are far too busy thinking about money, thinking about the long-term political futures of their parties, and not thinking enough about basic humanity. I'm also a wee bit surprised by the European Union, because some very good things continue to come from the European Union, the Commission and the Parliament, but there are ambiguities from the actions that have been taken. And then when you come to individual governments, and I don't just mean Hungary, but looking at Germany, there's still confusion about what they could and should get involved in. So I'd love to be optimistic and to say that I think we're closer to an end and a beginning of a new settlement in terms of actually trying to move towards a two-state solution. But there is no appetite for that, and as long as Bibi Netanyahu continues to have that sort of evil coalition of support that he has around him, he gets to carry on doing what they're doing, and the IDF does what it does. And the media apologists that they have around them there, as well as the support from the US and the UK and others, means that it just doesn't seem that we've got to a point where the numbers of dead actually matter enough, the numbers of injured and wounded matter enough. If we've bombed schools and hospitals, where does it stop? And I say we, in terms of the Israeli forces that are at work. So, no, I'm sorry, I can't be hopeful at this point, because I just don't see the evidence that we accept that enough is enough. We've seen, just as maybe a final comment, we've seen the Labour Party gradually accept, David Lammy sort of seems to accept that maybe we've crossed the line in terms of the levels of harm that have been done. But yeah, wringing of hands rather than actually stopping arms sales, rather than making sure that here we speak with a single voice that demands that this stops. So yeah, I really despair of an imminent good, better, whatever outcome.
I mean, as reports come in from the United Nations of pregnant women having to have cesarean sections without anesthesia, of rising levels of infants being born either stillborn or sickly or dying from starvation. I mean, the horror just keeps on coming, and we stand by as horrified bystanders watching it. And yet there was a news report on Sky News 2 days ago that the Tories are telling the journalist involved that they're actually worried that there will be a ceasefire because it might benefit Labour. I mean, how cynical are UK politics and politicians, or Westminster-based politicians now, Hugh?
Well, I don't think it's a case of now. This kind of attitude has gone on for years, and what's really disappointing as well is the politicking of the situation, where the SNP were calling for a vote on a ceasefire, and we saw what happened, and the fact that they haven't been allowed to have that debate since that whole debacle. But the fact they were trying to make out that that it was a political ploy by the SNP, when the SNP and Plaid Cymru have both been calling for a ceasefire from very earliest days. And I agree what you just said. You've got Biden, who has got his eyes on hopefully trying to defeat Trump, and you've got the Conservative government in Westminster that is just in its final death throes. We're probably near nearer to getting another leader of the Conservative Party than we are getting a ceasefire in Gaza, and that's a depressing fact.
I mean, at Campbell, we're looking at some very. I've noted some interesting sort of statistics from the movement to sort of boycott Israeli product. As the international community seems, other than perhaps South Africa and Venezuela and some of the other notable countries, seem to be quite slow in pushing Israel overtly into changing its behaviours. Growing numbers of people around the world are, sort of doing what many of us did with the South African apartheid era, and that's sort of choosing personally to boycott Israeli products, or products from prominent Israeli backers, such as, for example, Starbucks, Costas, McDonald's. I mean, profits from McDonald's in the Middle East seem to be plummeting. Is there a case for, as with perhaps South Africa and the apartheid era, for individuals who feel revulsed? Is there something that we can do as individuals? And if so, what is moral for us to do?
That's really interesting. I mean, as a young student in the mid-late 70s, I was involved in sit-ins and various activities in Aberdeen University to persuade the university to disinvest in Barclays at the time, given their involvement in supporting the existing white South African regime. So yeah, I have some sympathies with that. And other boycotts over the years. They can work, but they're very slow on the whole. And even the freezing and sequestering of Russian assets, which is a live subject at the moment, in terms of deploying and reinvesting within, supporting Ukraine and helping Ukraine to rebuild in due course. It's relevant, I think, Israeli assets in the UK and the US, if they were actually genuinely to be sequestered, and if we stopped arms sales, I think collectively these would be really powerful actions. But our representatives need to grow a backbone and actually take that line. And at the moment, with Boris and his friend Dave doing the kind of politicking that they're doing globally, there's a certain amount of suitable rhetoric when it's deemed appropriate, but actually the follow through into deliberate actions, especially if it has the potential to harm the capital interests, the financial interests of these individuals and their friends, it's really, really messy. And it has to be said, I think, that the support for Israel is very definitely part of making sure that Iraq and it doesn't get any more messy, and that Iran in particular doesn't take a stronger role as a pseudo nuclear global power and all of the issues that could come with that. So this geopolitical slant on an issue that should frankly simply be a humanitarian one is deeply depressing. And I don't think you're wrong to suggest that there should be that kind of lobbying and individual action. I think protest is incredibly important in whatever form it takes. I also think some of the fabulous work that the Nordic countries, some from the UK and elsewhere, are doing in terms of humanitarian support as best they can in Palestine is also really important. And the West Bank is also a very important part of that, because Israel's continuing to be aggressive and destructive there. So there are various actions that people can take, but are they enough? Are they quick enough? Are they likely to have the level of dramatic leverage that's required? Ahima.
I mean, in terms of the double standards that we see, if Palestinians were whiter, do you think more people would care, Hugh?
Sadly, clearly, yes. We've seen the attitudes towards Ukraine, and rightly so. The people showing solidarity with Ukrainians, but I think people can identify with Ukrainians because they're white Western Europeans. And I think what's interesting as well is, like I say, I think being able to protest and having marches, it does make a difference. And the fact that you've got a government now who are trying to bring in legislation to solve a problem that doesn't exist, to try and to stop that, because basically what we heard from Gove this week, it is this attempt to demonise certain sections of society, and that section of society are Muslims, and and that's where I think what we've seen over the last sort of few months and years is this rising racism that is targeted towards people of the Muslim faith, and I think that is a big issue, and it's something that needs to be addressed.
And do you think that the recent events with Frank Hester, the Tory donor who's benefited greatly from NHS privatised contracts and has funded the Tory party to the tune of £15 million and given Rishi Sunak numerous helicopter rides and others? I mean, do you think that this displays a double standards and in terms of the kind of misogyny and pretty overt now racism that many would say is kind of bubbling back to the top in society, or certain sections of society, particularly perhaps in parts of England?
It's,
Campbell. Oh, sorry, Hugh, on you go.
Yeah.
Well, no, I was just
Oh,
going to say,
sorry.
it's never gone away, has it? The fact that I think the UK is sort of inherently a racist society, and I know we'll be discussing Vaughan Gething's election as leader of the Labour Party in Wales later on. But yeah, no, the fact that with Hester, that he apologised for being rude, but all this thing, we should move on. He's apologised. He hasn't. He hasn't recognised his language as being racist and misogynistic. But I don't know about you two, but the one way that I tend to spot people who are racist and misogynist is when they say racist and misogynistic stuff. You can't just say something but then try and claim that you're not something. So yeah.
But I mean, it's not just the racism and the misogyny. It was the sort of talk of pretty extreme physical violence against the United Kingdom's first black MP, and following on from the murders of two previous MPs. I mean, Campbell, what's your take on the way in which Westminster has handled this, especially watching Lindsay Hoyle? Diana Abbott stands up 46 times. White men get to talk about her, but she's not given a voice herself. What's going on with Lindsay Hoyle and what's going on with Westminster?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's pretty shameless. I know that in the political arena and in broader society, there's usually quite enough hypocrisy to go around. But my goodness, we've seen the barrel well and truly scraped in recent time. I mean, it was unbelievable that the best Mr. Sunak could do was to sort of think about whether or not anything should be said for some considerable time. But as you point out with Lindsay Hoyle, the backstory to all of this goes really quite a long way. And in fact, you probably have to go back to the previous speaker and the grief that John Bercow got for actually trying to hold the government to account and actually, making sure that there was not just discipline in the House, but there was a degree of honesty and accountability. Well, frankly, we've just lost the plot on that. I would argue that it goes back to 2014, if not earlier, and having had some contact with some of the leaders of the Conservative Party back in my days in Oxford as a postdoc in the mid-80s, there is a long tradition of extremely arrogant bad behaviour that has sort of become part of the way in which the Westminster model works. Now, you could go back to the Rotten Boroughs. Parliament's been pretty corrupt for a long time, but we've made something of an art form of it now. And the way in which things are working, it is about power and about leverage behind the scenes, and it's about money. And when those things dominate over principle, then this is what you get. And I think there is racism, there is misogyny, there is just blatant arrogance and self-interest in the way in which the system has now evolved. And I think it's reflected in public trust. There's a degree of a plague on both all your houses, things that have happened, the impact of social media, the disingenuity of individual politicians and what they say publicly versus privately, etc. We really have lost the plot. And I think the Americanization in that sense and the polarization of politics has just got worse. How on earth do we get back onto the path, I think, is the challenge. And I think civil society generally is pretty fed up with this, pretty disgusted by it. But unless lots of us stand for political office, we're stuck with those who are prepared to stand and the massive hubris and self-interest that they seem to represent. And the venal has now got a very clear reward because you get to look out for yourself in the future and all of your mates. And the corruption of the COVID process was clearly a big part of that. So I'm sorry to be so doom and gloom, but that is frankly where I see we are. And if the leader of the UK Labour Party can nobble the speaker behind the scenes to make sure that the deal is done to prevent the SNP being able to speak, and if it's then used in the same way, essentially, I don't know who did it, but probably from the other side of the house, but to prevent Diane speaking, it's just a reflection of the fact that any small disagreeing voice is going to be squashed, even if actually it represents quite a large part of the electorate's interest. This is the corrupt state that the UK essentially has become.
I mean, we've got the MPs announced or being announced that the MPs are getting a 5.5% pay rise to take their salary to £91,000+ annually. Again, one of the political editors from one of the news outlets was saying that it's unlikely that there's going to be an early election because so many of the new Tory MPs are so now in debt that they need several more months of their salary to kind of get themselves out of debt, which says a whole lot about the way that they view the deserving poor and the undeserving poor and fiscal management. We've got. It just seems to be that there's this barreling. One of the arguments I heard given was that the Tories didn't have to give back this £15 million because money had no conscience and money couldn't be racist, which is very Ozark. For those who have watched it, there's a wonderful line in Ozark which did make me perk my ears up with the parallels. Meanwhile, Labour have still got Diane Abbott out of the party for a kind of so-called crime that actually is very similar to ones which white males have done, but were readmitted after similar apologies. So this whole thing about we're being told that we would have Christian values to forgive Frank Hester and move on, and yet apparently Diane Abbott's comments were unforgivable. I mean, Hugh, do you think the general public see the rank hypocrisy that many political commentators consider to be clearly on display?
You would hope so, and I think that's why ventures like what we're developing in Wales with Talking Wales and with Broadcast Scotland are so important, because are the public getting to hear this information? Yes, to a certain extent. I think the BBC does a fair to good job overall, but I think there's a lot to be desired when it comes to politics. When you look at things like Laura Koonsberg, and Fiona Bruce on Question Time, but I think the fact that the right wing press is basically it is failing, from a print perspective, but they're still very powerful in a digital age, and people do. How do people get information? How do we have an ideas informed society? And I think that's, for me, is what one of the key things moving forward that you would hope any new government would look to prioritise. But sadly, for the Conservatives, it suited them having a weak media or a media that serves their purposes. But we're so desperately in need of objective and informative journalism.
I mean, there's a whole other discussion that we don't have time for today about the state of journalism and the need for independent local journalism across the British Isles as local newspapers have all been amalgamated and sort of come under sort of one big ownership, really. But I mean, in terms of sort of the media and political leaders. I mean, really sort of looking at the route that has been taken sort of since Murdoch appeared on the scene, first Thatcher and then Blair, sort of very much in Murdoch's pocket and looking at the way in which newspaper editors have been given access to Number 10 over the last, was something we've discussed on Broadcasting Scotland before, unprecedented levels of access that Rupert Murdoch has and the right wing press have compared to the left of centre press. But I mean, looking at, for example, Wales and recent events or yesterday's events in Wales, I mean, Vaughan Getting has been announced as the new leader for Labour in Wales and makes history as he becomes Wales' first black first minister, and in fact the first political leader of any country across the continent of Europe who's of sort of African Welsh heritage. I mean, what does his appointment mean for Wales, and not only sort of socially, but in terms of politics? I mean, is Starmerism? He's very much a Starmerist. I mean, is Starmerism sort of Blair light or Blair right? And I mean, sort of looking at the way in which he deals with the media, that sort of raised a few eyebrows in journalistic circles. Hugh, you'll know more about that.
Yeah, and I think he was on BBC Wales television this morning, and he was being questioned excellently by Teleri Glyn, and he used the line a serious journalist, because basically there's been two journalists in Wales who have dared to scrutinise his campaign. The fact that he's taken, that he received £200,000 for his leadership campaign, which is an enormous amount of money. I think Jeremy Miles, his opponent, had something like £25,000 behind him. And the company who donated the £200,000, one of their directors been convicted twice of with regard, criminal proceedings in relation to environmental issues. So, and the fact, he was questioning on that again this morning, and he didn't realise, it was all about, we followed the rules, we declared everything. The fact that he took £200,000 from somebody with convictions didn't seem to bother him. And the worrying thing is, it would appear because, he had access to union members because of the support of unions towards him, and he had the money to get people on the phones to do that. But I think it's great that Wales has black leaders. It shows diversity. Wales has some of the oldest black communities in the United Kingdom, in Cardiff and Newport. It's just sad that as First Minister, as he will become next week, is that he is seen as somebody who is tainted. His dealings with journalists and in the past, he has come across as being thin-skinned, and he's been rude to about his colleagues on Teams meetings during COVID. So as a character, I don't think he's going to be the best First Minister, but I think the fact that he does come from a diverse background is something we should celebrate.
I mean, it's obviously having somebody from a sort of diverse background, it's great to have more representation, but it doesn't take away from the fact that his individual personality may not be that which is of perhaps we say sort of traditional Labour values. I mean, with his mean, Mark Drakeford really was sort of like the last of the
Yeah, but
politicians that
Drake,
I would recognise as being what Labour stands for. Campbell, do you think that as we watch as we watch as we watch the rise of Starmer's Labour, I mean, it really does seem to be that the Blairism has kind of won. I mean, I can't think of any politicians now that are Labour Party that actually have what I would call traditional Labour values. So looking at it from a Scottish perspective, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that, and I respect the fact that Hugh's got more of an insight there than I have. But I think it's great that we have two women at the head of the administration in Northern Ireland, and we've got three parts of these islands, and arguably four parts of these islands with people of colour and with diverse heritage, and that's great. But I think electability and actual robust, effective credibility as politicians likely to deliver against a vision that would be widely supported, it's not guaranteed. So diversity is great, but it's not enough in this context to deliver good governance and good quality policy outcomes, in my view. Old Labour, I worked earlier in my career with some really strong characters from very traditional roots of the Labour Party that would have been recognised all the way back to Keir Hardie. I'm afraid the fact that we've got leaders of parties that are called Sir Whatever, both Lib Dems and Labour, it kind of tells you that the incorporation of political parties is pretty much complete from a Marxist point of view. I don't see people of genuine integrity who either understand Labour with a capital L or want to deliver Labour in that sense exist. Even looking to the rest of Europe, I used to have close contacts with the Arbeider Party in Norway, Labour Party. We're not in that space anymore, and as we get, generally speaking, better off, the world in that sense changes, and what matters changes. Manufacturing industry isn't what it was. Service industry behaves very differently. So there are economic and social drivers that have got us to where we are. But I am most worried about the basic corruption of the model, because several members, I don't even want to start talking about the corruption of the Conservative Party, because that's pretty obvious and has been for well over a decade. And as I said, COVID highlighted that. But the fact that several members of the front bench of the Labour Party in Westminster have accepted substantial sums of money from private healthcare companies tells you all you need to know about the direction of travel of the NHS, at least at the English level, maybe also at the Welsh. We have held out rather longer in Scotland, but because of the Barnett model and the starvation by Westminster of Scottish funding and the inability to borrow and the fact that we are not independent, we are therefore dependent upon a model that is increasingly corrupt. So that also, I'm afraid, deeply depresses me. I think that there is not a credible socialist strand running through the leadership of the Labour Party. And we need to look elsewhere, and that's an increasingly limited space, it seems to me, for us to find people of genuine integrity who understand the majority of the population, and especially workers in that population.
I mean, it could be said that the corruption in politics coming out of Westminster and beyond has always been there, but it's just now sort of, because of European Union rules, which obviously we're now out of because of Brexit. It's the transparency of the cold light of day is shining more clearly upon that corruption. But I mean, Hugh, as traditional Labour kind of disintegrates before our eyes, does this give an opportunity for Plaid Cymru? Because I mean, Mark Drakeford has occupied the left of centre space very clearly. And is it possible that Plaid will do what the SNP did when Labour in Scotland sort of abandoned its left of centre position, and the SNP very adroitly stepped into that and clearly established themselves there? Is this an opportunity for Plaid, and will this help the cause for Welsh independence?
Yeah, it should do. But remember, we had Leanne Wood, who, I would say was probably the furthest sort of left of the leaders we've had in politics. alongside somebody like Corbyn. Um, and she was sort of ousted, and we had more of a sort of a centrist view. I think what's interesting, because I think when the Conservatives do well in Westminster, Labour do well in Wales, because they've always got something to point at. So I think the danger for Labour is, in Gething, they've got a Starmerite, as Drakeford was to the left. He was a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. And he was sort of that tradition, more of that traditional sort of Labour background, whereas Gething is, I would imagine, I think the fear for a lot of people is he's going to be Starmer's man in Wales, as opposed to somebody who is speaking up for Wales at Westminster. But we'll see what happens. But remember, we've got a general election this year, and in 2 years' time we'll have the Senate elections. I'm not sure when the next Holyrood elections are due, but I think in 2 years' time, if we've got a Labour government and they're not delivering that much change, which is likely, it's going to be an interesting time. But my fear is, though, the way the politics is going is, we have proportional representation in Wales, which led to us having over half a dozen UKIP members who were complete wastes of space when it came to actually doing anything, as opposed, otherwise than sort of moaning and complaining about things. This will open the door to reform, and in Wales, abolish the Assembly Party. We've actually got a party who wants to get rid of this tier of government. And and I'm afraid, when you look at education results, health outcomes in Wales, sort of devolution at the moment doesn't look successful. And we have to recognise that. So we have to make sure that we can, get improved devolution settlements and actually start improving things, because we've had 25 years of Labour in Wales, and we've got the worst health service and the worst education sort of system in the United Kingdom.
Well, moving on from that rather depressing vision, this week the Scottish Government published its long-awaited land reform bill, a major provision of which is to force large estates to be sold in smaller lots to help community buyers. I mean, in the week that it was announced that a billionaire from overseas had with a fairly allegedly shady background, as many of them seem to have, is allegedly is buying tens of thousands of acres from us of land in Scotland with a big estate. I mean, Campbell, is this land reform bill, does it have the teeth that we need to make genuine change for Scotland?
Let's see. I suppose my short answer is probably not. But I think it's a key step. It's an important step forward. Very quickly, as backdrop, as it was clear we were going to be talking about this, I was reaching back into my bookshelf to Andy Whiteman before he became a Green MSP and then left that role. Wrote this 1996, I think, and he was working on it before that. This one, The Poor Had No Lawyers, and actually looking at Leslie's work in Blossom and the things she covered there. We could go further back, in terms of various prominent Scots who've worked to try and get a radical or a more manageable conservative small c agenda through here. Land desperately needs to be reformed, that's for sure. These 1,000 hectare plus chunks of Scotland that are in private hands and frequently managed very poorly, sporting estates, etc. And access limited, all sorts of issues about the inheritance of clearances, etc. I mean, it goes back such a long way. It's a big, long, complicated story. And the socio-economic impact of that has been extremely dramatic. So, as has happened in parts of rural Norway, total depopulation, and then it took very active interventions to put people back, to encourage people to stay, etc. And now we have incomers in a variety of parts of Scotland, including new Scots, people who do want to be there, but having additional homes, pricing out local people, there not being local employment actually to work on, even with the Brexit shambles and the loss of European workers who actually help to sustain a lot of our rural economies. There is a massive set of issues here to be tackled. One piece of legislation ain't going to fix it, but it's a part of a journey that we have to be on. Giving local communities the right of first knowledge that there is an upcoming sale, helping to break down very large chunks of land into more manageable plots, helping to support community trusts and groupings to be able to afford to invest in and potentially compete for sales. These are all really important steps towards changing the way in which Scotland looks, works, is managed, etc. But it's going to be a big journey. I mean, it's good that there was really good work done by previous people in leadership roles here, and that has been really good. And a lot of thought work has been done, thinking about different strategies that might work. And now we've got a former senior member of the SNP government, the chair of the key body involved. But we also need local government doing things differently. We need private capital and we need public capital working together, as well as helping to support the psychology of people that they think they can actually do something about this, and that future land management can be different. So that rather than exporting the value for those who come and blast the living daylights out of small birds on a periodic basis, we actually can have people living, working, recreating, being peaceful in some of the most beautiful parts of the planet. But it's going to take us a wee while to get there. This one piece of legislation is good, but it's just one step along a longer path.
I mean, when you see these estates when they're advertised for sale, it is sort of it's hard to believe that we're in a post-colonialist nation, because so just see these being advertised as be your own laird, 30,000 residents live on your land. I mean, it's very much like sort of Downton Abbey meets a kilt maker. I mean, Hugh, obviously, this is something that is an issue you see in Wales as well, where there's very much this sense by people of a certain mindset that the land and the people upon it, it's kind of just like the Disneyfication of entire communities. What's your perspective on the situation of land ownership in Scotland from your Welsh position?
Yeah, because I think this is one of those England and Wales situations, because obviously sort of land ownership in Scotland is different to that in England and Wales. There is a project actually called Who Owns Wales, which is a research project that's been carried out to look at who actually does own sort of the land in Wales. We have less of a situation here in Wales because sort of land-wise, Wales is smaller than Scotland, and huge bits of Wales are mountains and are sort of uninhabitable. Or have very few people living on them. So we have got some of those big estates, but nothing compared to Scotland and that historic tradition of that land ownership. But we do have, there was a map published this week showing the amount of second home ownership, and in Wales, especially along the western sort of seaboard, it is alarming, and it is having a huge impact on communities around ownership, around people being able to live in the communities where they were raised. And there is something, in fairness, that the Welsh Labour government, in conjunction with Plaid Cymru, are looking to address. So it is something that is actually being the second home ownership issue, something being addressed. But as for land ownership, the Crown Estate, for example, it's devolved in Scotland. It's not devolved in Wales. So any money from the Crown Estate goes to the Crown Estate. So there are fundamental sort of land reforms that need to happen in Wales. But I think a lot of people say we should be moving towards a land owned economy. So actually putting a value on, on land that people have, as opposed to, sort of their incomes. And I think that's another area that's quite interesting.
I mean, certainly
Could I
that's
just
an
add
issue
that?
in the island of Islay, for example. I was there a while back, and islanders were saying to me that they were outraged that, for example, the system of taxation meant that the local primary school paid more council tax than the individual that owned a large chunk of the island itself. I mean, is this a way in which we could move forward, with through meaningful taxation of land rather than income, as you says, and does this new reform bill go anywhere towards tackling that, Campbell?
I don't think it really does at this point, but I think you're absolutely right that the overall model that lies around this financially and economically uh, is really important. And I was actually just going to touch on the fact that one of the really good innovations that was established within Wales, the Commissioner for the Future, essentially, was looking at sustainability issues and also about intergenerational equity and the like. And I think the first commissioner, Helen, did some really interesting things, which also upset quite a lot of people. And the new commissioner seems perhaps a little more measured, but that's its early days. But it's a very interesting thing to actually have somebody in government who is thinking about the nature of the whole asset base, what is fair, what is actually sustainable, rather than simply managing individual portfolios. I wish there was something like that within the Scottish context. And we often have a real difficulty in making any future policy that it ends up stuck in a silo. So trying to get things that connect human rights, the environment, justice generally, and economy, etc., and education. I mean, all of the things that are actually relevant to boosting rural populations. It's really, really hard to get that to happen because there are egos, there are different structures and systems, there are different communication models, and it's just really hard to get people together. Also, when you get some senior appointments that are either very political or they're not political because they're trying not to frighten the horses, it's really difficult to get good quality people working on a long-term strategy to implement the kind of changes that are required. We have a very unequal society. We have assets that are owned outside Scotland or owned by a very few. Delivering improvement there needs a rethink, which has been going on, but it needs a rethink of the whole model. And that then needs to be operationalized. And as usual, I'm impatient. We need to be getting on with this rather than more studies, more thinking, more reflecting, more chat. We actually need to try some stuff and intervene, make it happen, see if it works. If it works, continue it. If it doesn't work, stop, try do something else. We're not very good at that. There's much too much pondering and also worrying about who might be slightly offended. If the taxation model is one of doing it, removing any reliefs and actually upping charges for those that have second homes or whatever, get on with it. Let's stop talking about it because we don't want to end up in the worst elements of the Owen Glendower days. We want actually to have good civil policy that results in good environmental and social outcomes and viable economies. That doesn't just happen. It needs intervention, and it needs a government and a series of associated players with some oomph actually to get on with it and lead.
I was at a meeting at the end of last year where sort of, I think it was the Scottish Land Commission, if my bad memory serves me correctly, talking about change in the Angus estates, where I live in Angus. And I went along to this meeting online, and there were a lot of the big estate owners I recognise as were there, and I, perhaps understandably, was the only person who raised the question about a fair and equitable non-Zimbabwe style way of ensuring that these estates, that sort of more Scots had access to these parcels of land, and perhaps starting as new entrants for farming or sort of hutting or whatever they chose to do with that, and to break up these large sort of monolithic chunks of land. And as one might imagine, there were howls of outrage about that. And one of the arguments coming from one person who actually, is doing some really very, very good agroecological work is that, oh, well, we're big landowners, so we've got the money to be able to make the changes that we need to address the climate emergency and the polycrisis of biodiversity collapse. And do you think that this argument, which may have a degree of validity to it, do you think this argument is going to be one which is used to try and stop change, which is that we're bigger, we know better, and, hey, climate emergency is coming? I mean, who can argue with that? Campbell.
Sorry. Yeah. I agree with you, which may not be helpful. I think I was certainly involved back in the 90s in community forestry projects, which were about trying to redistribute land into connected, purposeful community engagement, forestry, economic activity, etc. Trying to get that stuff to happen, it was really hard, and there were always big vested interests in those processes, and it often did come down to money. But we managed to get, at that time, for the Central Scotland Forest Project, we managed to get government support financially as well as in terms of contractual tools that would allow land to be managed on a more collegiate basis, etc., and with good granting funding mechanisms. Andrew Thin, who was responsible for the land body you were referring to, I mean, Andrew was very aware of that and tried really hard to nudge those things forward. But there are these big interests, and what we were talking about before in terms of UK politics and the influence of big capital. When big capital gets close to government in that way, they get into the ear of the decision makers, and so they can kibosh perfectly legitimate and good bottom-up initiatives. And that was one of the reasons that the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland was set up, trying to help small community individuals as well as small community groups to test and hopefully win against some of those others who were trying to stop them doing things that were legitimate, and actually to use the law in the right way. So there are elements of hope in terms of some of the things that are scattered around the landscape here, and there's some really good practice that has been worked in the past, the Ibriachan project and various things on coal and elsewhere, but an egg. But we have still got a long way to go, because if decisions are taken by those who are absent but wealthy and well connected, then we won't get what is needed for the larger part of the population.
Well, I mean, speaking about a population which is doing very well, I mean, this week EU President Ursula von der Leyen was in Faroe to sign a partnership agreement with the Faroese, and there's a video coming up just now, I believe.
And my visit today shows how much the European Union values our partnership and friendship. It is a trusted partnership, and I think it's a natural partnership because, of course, the Faroe Islands belong to the wider European family. We share the same values. We are democracies actively promoting stability and a global order that is based on rules. Our support to the brave nation of Ukraine is truly commendable, and we join forces here. And I want to thank you for your efforts to align on our sanctions against Russia. I know this comes at a cost to the Faroe Islands. The more we are impressed by your clear stance, and rest assured we stand by your side what this is concerned. And with our new declaration on enhanced cooperation that we have signed just a minute ago, we are basically opening a new chapter on our economic and our political cooperation. Let me deep dive a little bit on that topic. First of all, of course, we are deepening our trade relations. The European Union is already among your top trading partners, and we can build on decades of excellent cooperation with privileged access for your products to our single market. In 2022, almost 100% of our seafood exports to Europe came in duty-free. But now with the new agreement, we will discuss now how to improve further your access to our market. And here we want to include in our discussion also the higher value-added seafood products, so the processed seafood products. And it includes the understanding, of course, and we've discussed that we keep high standards in terms of sustainability and fisheries management. The second point I want to stress is that we also want to broaden the scope of our partnership. We are already doing great work together under, for example, Europe's Horizon program. We just saw the renewable energy where Horizon Europe played a role in developing these technologies. We're teaming up on the Arctic research, for example. We would like to start working on more areas where we share interests, be it digital technologies, the education or skills development. And yes, we've spoken about Erasmus Plus and Creative Europe, and we would be very happy to deepen the cooperation here and to increase the numbers of exchanges, for example, in Erasmus Plus. Of course, a very important topic for us is the fight against climate change. You have impressive resources for wind and hydropower, and I saw it today as we were seeing the wind park and the whole concept of renewable energy. So I am not only deeply impressed, but I'm absolutely sure that you will reach your goals of sourcing all your land-based electricity from sustainable supplies by 2030. This is what you presented today in the morning, and this was amazing to see the strategic approach to really reach the goal by 2030 for renewable energy.
Well, I mean, that's enough to make you greet coming from a Scottish perspective, isn't it? I mean, the Faroe is a self-governing archipelago. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Its population, about 53,000 people. I mean, the Faroe is not part of the EU, and it's not part of EFTA. It has a free trade agreement with the EU. It is, EU is its biggest trading partner, and look at what they're able to achieve. And we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I mean, Campbell, with Labour and the Tories sticking to Brexit, is independence the only route back to the EU for Scotland? And watching that, how likely do you think it is we will be, at least in some degrees, welcomed with open arms as business trading partners with the EU?
I think the latter part of that is far easier than the former part. I think, yes, I have every indication that Scotland would be extremely welcome, and you're right. I mean, it does go to you greet a wee community like Faroes. Fabulous to see them having closer ties. Negotiations are on way with Bosnia-Herzegovina. We know also that Ursula von der Leyen spent some time in Greenland. Again, resource-rich but small community. We could be part of this family very, very easily. The only way we can do that is by getting out of this messy, toxic, choking union. There is simply no alternative, because Labour, Lib Dems, probably almost irrelevant, but the Tories are deeply hostile. They've all got their second homes in Europe already. They've got their other passports. They don't need to worry about it. But the rest of us are being messed about by being outside this. Scotland, particularly because of the continued reduction in the Barnett model, means that we are getting less and less money to do what is greater work, because the damage level is so high. So yeah, we need to get back, and we need to get back as quickly as possible.
You've got 5 seconds, 10 seconds, Hugh. What's your perspective on that?
I agree with everything Campbell said. Basically, when you look at something like the Faroe Islands, it just goes to show you that it doesn't matter, how big you are. You can be an independent nation.
There you go. Scotland's big enough, strong enough, and clever enough, with enough wind power to keep everybody happy. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we demand on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. And also, if you've got time, check us out and see if you fancy being a Broadcasting Scotland volunteer, because you too could be sitting in the hot seat, smiling back at you, and you you'd be very welcome. To everyone who's donated and to everyone who signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We cannot exist without your support. To my guests, Campbell, Gemmell and Hugh Marshall, thank you very much. My name's Ruth Watson. Goodbye.